This is an ABC News special report. Now reporting, George Stephanopoulos.
Good afternoon. We are coming on the air again in a day of bombshell developments in the legal situation facing President Trump and his presidential campaign. Word just in that his former campaign chair, Paul Manafort, has been found guilty on 8 counts of tax evasion and bank fraud. He was facing 18 counts in that trial. I want to go straight to our senior justice correspondent at the courthouse, Pierre Thomas. What's the latest?
George, the dramatic verdict has just come in. 8 counts. Paul Manafort has been convicted on 8 counts, 5 regarding tax evasion charges. He's also convicted on a failure to file foreign bank accounts and financial assets count, and also a bank fraud account as well. So, George, what you're seeing here is the power of the federal prosecutors. 18 counts. The judge decided that on the 10 counts that they could not get a jury unanimous vote, those are declared as mistrials, but he has been convicted on 8 counts, George. Again, the power of a federal prosecutor in that there were 18 counts that this man faced. He's now going to have jail time on at least 8 of those counts, George.
Facing several years, perhaps, in jail. Terry Moran been covering the trial as well. Pierre Thomas talks about the power of a federal prosecutor. Not a complete grand slam home run here for the prosecutors, but guilty on 8 counts. Significant blow to Paul Manafort and President Trump.
It is a significant development, obviously, for Special Counsel Robert Mueller. This is the first test before a jury of his investigation, and it is a partial success on those tax crimes that Paul Manafort has just been found guilty of, and a bank fraud and the failure to file ownership of a foreign bank account or foreign asset. But this is also the power of the jury system. They were given a very dense, very difficult document-driven case. They sorted through it. They came to an agreement on the prosecution's strongest case. I've talked to defense lawyers who did think that those tax crimes, they were pretty strong cases for the prosecution. These other ones, though, the jury threw out. So how much of an impact this has politically, it probably does strengthen Special Counsel Robert Mueller's hand. He does have a victory, but it also shows that the jury just, in this case, shut all that out, and they went methodically through the evidence. They came to the agreements they could and punted on the rest.
And, of course, Paul Manafort also now faces a second trial in Washington, D.C. on several charges, including lying to the FBI, conspiracy to defraud the United States, witness tampering. So he is facing even more legal trouble going forward. We want to bring in Chris Christie, who also worked with President Trump on that campaign as an outside advisor after Paul Manafort was chairman. Chris Christie, none of these charges have anything to do with his campaign work for President Trump, Paul Manafort's campaign work for President Trump. But President Trump has recently, as Friday, called out this investigation, called out this trial, and called Paul Manafort a good man.
Yeah, well, listen, George, I think, one, this part of it has never involved a campaign. But I think the important thing is this is a mixed bag for this special counsel. Because if you look at the counts, at least as far as I can tell right now, that wound up to be a guilty verdict, they had very little to do with Rick Gates. And the ones that the jury hung on seem to be the ones that were much more dependent upon Gates' testimony.
We should explain who Rick Gates is. He was the former deputy campaign chair, longtime colleague of Paul Manafort, who was originally charged with Paul Manafort, but then took a plea and was the cooperating witness against him.
And he was the main verbal witness, non-document witness. Now, this has real implications for the next trial, because the next trial, I think, will be much more dependent upon Rick Gates than even this first trial was, George. And so, I think if you're in the Mueller team, you're happy. This is a win. This is a win and justifies your prosecution. But I think you're going to have to take a
that may be true, Chris, but let me interrupt you right there, because the Mueller's team is saying they have far more documents for that second trial than they even had for this first trial.
They may, George, but when you look at the allegations in the second trial, it will also be to really sell that to a jury. They're going to need Gates to be a narrator. We call it in the business, to narrate them through that in addition to the FBI agents. And so I just think that it's going to be a time where Mueller is going to look back on how they tried this case, how well they prepared Gates, and what kind of witness Gates is as he gets ready for trial number 2.
And we're seeing Rick Gates there behind Paul Manafort there on the screen. He's the man in the circle right there. Another question on this, Chris Christie. One of the big questions is, was this all an attempt to pressure Paul Manafort to give information on President Trump? He's withstood that so far. Does this give another opening to prosecutors, or is that just gone?
Listen, there's always an opportunity to do it when you've got a second trial that you're getting ready for and more charges for him to face. And now he has the certainty of facing some jail time. And so now it's all in a even more complete context for Manafort. But I would tell you, George, I think if he hasn't cooperated at this point, he's probably not going to. And that could mean one of two things. Either he doesn't care to cooperate or he's got nothing to cooperate with.
And Pierre Thomas, senior justice correspondent, before we go, 10 counts, a mistrial on 10 counts. Prosecutors will also now face the choice of whether to try to retry on those charges.
George, I think one of the things we have to factor in is, aside from the politics, there's the human nature of this. Paul Manafort is currently in jail on allegations of witness tampering. With these 8 convictions, he's facing years in jail. Years in jail. That's what the situation is for him. He won't be out in the public for any time soon. And again, he's got another trial ahead of him, but he's now looking at convictions that would land him in jail for years.
And Cecilia Vega at the White House, as I said, Cecilia, the president called Paul Manafort a good man on Friday as he was speaking out against the Mueller investigation. But the White House has had conflicting things to say about Paul Manafort as well. At first, they tried to push him off as someone who didn't have a great deal to do with the campaign, even though he was the campaign chair.
Yeah, they tried to paint him as a two-bit player, a small player in the campaign. And you're right, he rose to the rank of campaign manager and really was the person who coordinated the Republican National Convention for this team. He was not a two-bit player. And as we've been saying, the Russia investigation, Trump himself was not a part of this trial. But make no mistake about this, George, indirectly, this White House is very much linked to Paul Manafort and this trial that is just taking place right now. Surprisingly, or perhaps not, we have not heard any comment from President Trump himself. We have not heard a comment from the White House. We have yet to hear a comment directly from anyone affiliated with the campaign. We were going to attempt to ask the president questions about this, about the Michael Cohen deal today, and instead they canceled his departure on the South Lawn here at the White House, the only opportunity where reporters like myself would have been allowed to ask the president questions today. They said that there was bad weather. I don't know if you can see behind me here, George. The skies are pretty sunny at this point. So no questions for the president on this one just yet.
As I said, a day of bombshell developments in the legal matters surrounding President Trump and his campaign. His former campaign chair, Paul Manafort, found guilty on 8 counts of tax evasion, failing to file foreign bank accounts, and bank fraud and bank conspiracy. Mistrial on 10 other counts. Open question whether prosecutors are going to continue to pursue that. Of course, Paul Manafort does face a second trial in Washington, D.C. on a host of charges as well. And as I said, this comes on the day when the president's former personal attorney, Michael Cohen, has pled guilty. He's in a courthouse now in the Southern District of New York, pleading guilty to charges of campaign finance violations dealing with the 2016 campaign, also tax evasion and bank fraud. We're expecting to hear from the assistant U.S. attorney who's prosecuting that case, Robert Khuzami, shortly. We'll be back on the air when that comes. And, of course, a full report tonight on World News Tonight with David Muir.
We are continuing this special report on this verdict in the Paul Manafort trial. The jury finding him guilty on 8 counts, varying in forms of tax evasion, bank fraud, illegal use of foreign bank accounts, but hung jury on 10 counts. He was facing 18 in total. The jury could not reach a verdict on 10 of those counts, so the judge will be declaring a mistrial on those 10 counts. It will be up to prosecutors if they want to retry him. But again, Paul Manafort, President Trump's former campaign chair, found guilty on 8 counts in this case. Devin Dwyer, our coordinating producer, is standing by for us in D.C. And Devin, how significant is this, given there was no actual relation between this and the Trump campaign or the Russia probe, but this being Robert Mueller's first case?
Well, as you heard from our team over at the courthouse, that this was a very significant moment for Robert Mueller. The first test is sort of a vindication of his legal efforts to go after President Trump's team here, corruption, if you will, around the campaign. But President Trump's supporters, the White House, though they haven't weighed in officially yet, would say, look, this is a sign that they have nothing on the president, that the fact that they have now convicted Paul Manafort on these tax charges, fraud charges, none of that happened, connected to the campaign, as you say. But what was fascinating in this trial was that it was taking place during the time he was leading the Trump campaign. Paul Manafort did not file tax returns. He did not report these accounts while he was there in the mix in the late days of 2016. So very close to the president here, sort of a surreal afternoon, Diane, in addition to what's going on with Michael Cohen, that this has hit so close to President Trump.
Yeah, quite a big day in terms of court proceedings related to the president. Devin, I want to bring in Pierre Thomas. He's there at the courthouse. And Pierre, what do we know so far about these counts on which Manafort was found guilty?
Well, again, 8 counts he's found guilty. He's facing likely years in jail. Tax evasion charges, there were 5 counts of that. There was a failure to file a foreign bank account on another charge, and there was a bank fraud charge and a conspiracy charge. So, again, you have to put in perspective that he's already in jail being held in connection with witness tampering, allegations of witness tampering. So this was, while it was a mixed verdict, it clearly is a very difficult day for Manafort and his family. The man is going to face, again, years in jail, and he's another trial coming up in regard to whether he was acting illegally as a foreign agent on the behalf of the Ukrainian officials. So, again, difficult day for the Manafort team and his family, but in terms of the politics, there were 10 counts which the jury could not come to a unanimous verdict on, and the judge declared a mistrial on those 10 counts.
And Pierre, any sort of inclination of how this case might affect that other case that Manafort has ahead of him?
Well, again, they're separate cases, but they're also being held and tried by the special counsel. So from their standpoint, the fact that they got convictions in which this man will be facing jail time, he's now a convicted felon, if you will. So from that standpoint, it gives legitimacy to their investigation. But again, there will be politics involved where some people will say, well, you didn't get a slam dunk because you didn't get all the charges, convictions on all the charges. But again, in practical terms, for the man who is facing 18 counts, he's now looking at jail time in the course of years.
All right, Pierre Thomas for us there in Alexandria, Virginia. Pierre, thank you. I want to go over to Kate Shaw, ABC News consultant. Kate, we heard Pierre talking about the political ramifications of being found guilty on 8 counts, but getting a hung jury on the other 10. What are the legal ramifications of all of this?
Well, I mean, so Pierre's talking about the possibility of jail time, and of course now, you know, we're looking at there could be decades in terms of a sentence that could attach to the convictions on the 8 counts the jury did convict on. But, you know, an additional legal question that has to be swirling around the White House and the president's advisors right now is the question of pardons, right? The president has the unilateral power to pardon. He could pardon Paul Manafort today if he wanted to. You know, you could pardon for conduct that hasn't been tried or convicted yet. So that the pardons could extend even to the kinds of things that haven't yet been trialed in the D.C. case that's scheduled for September. So, you know, I think there have to be a lot of conversations ongoing right now about whether the use of that kind of unilateral power, and, you know, you see with these security clearance strippings or the single security clearance stripping that the president is flexing his muscles in terms of some of this unilateral presidential power. So I imagine he at least is thinking about that.
And Kate, in terms of the relation to the campaign, you know, this wasn't a direct tie-in with the Russia investigation. It was Robert Mueller's first case. But it sounds like some of this was going on while Paul Manafort was working for the campaign. Could the campaign somehow get dragged into this now?
You know, I think there are a couple of possible linkages. One is the kind of timing connection, right? Some of this conduct was ongoing while Paul Manafort was connected to the campaign. So there's that linkage. And then there actually is the linkage not just to the campaign, but to the Russia probe, at least in general terms, in that, you know, the funds that were being hidden in banks and that weren't then being reported, that were the subject of the tax fraud claims that the jury did convict on, the source of all those funds, or many of them, were Ukrainian clients of Paul Manafort, many of which were Russian affiliated. So there's a connection to Russia sort of that lays behind a lot of the conduct that's at issue here. So both Russia and the campaign are in the background, even though none of those things are squarely at issue in terms of the conduct that was charged and on which the jury convicted.
Now, from the perspective of the Trump campaign, if there is something to worry about, do you find the fact that he hasn't cooperated with prosecutors until this point, is that reassuring? Does that sort of mean he either doesn't want to or doesn't have anything? Or could he now go forward and still cooperate in the future with this next case?
He absolutely could, and I think stranger things have happened, but I would be very surprised, having sort of withstood the pressure to cooperate, even facing the amount of jail time that he is facing. To this point, it doesn't seem that likely to me that he's going to reverse course now. I think far more likely he's holding out the hope that he gets a complete pardon and never has to do any jail time at all.
And now he's looking at jail time, it sounds like, with these 8 counts at least. He's already been in jail on this witness tampering issue, and it will be until he serves in that next case. So what are the potential that we're looking at in terms of how much time Paul Manafort could get here?
It looks like decades. I mean, the total in terms of the 18 counts, it looked like he was facing something like 300 years of aggregate jail time. And I think in terms of the 8 that we've seen that the convictions are on, it looks like up to 80 years. So, functionally, that would be life in prison. Of course, that's the outside limit, and a sentencing judge would by no means be obligated to give that kind of maximum sentence. But it's essentially life in prison that could be on the table.
Is there any way for Paul Manafort to sort of make things better for himself at this point?
Well, look, he could choose to cooperate, and then, of course, to the extent that he had useful information to provide to the prosecutors, the possibility of a reduced prison sentence would very much be kind of on the table. Or, he can make it clear to the president and his team that he's interested in a pardon. But I would say that those are, at this point, look, he could appeal these, point to some errors in terms of these proceedings, and obviously he's got a legal team that I imagine would be able to continue fighting. But obviously this is a tough day for him and his family.
And in terms of the ramifications and a potential, this potentially affecting, the White House, the president, one of the star witnesses, or the star witness in this case, was Rick Gates, who worked side by side with Manafort for many years, both in his businesses but also in the campaign itself. Could Gates pose a problem for the president?
So Gates' testimony was not as effective as the prosecutors had hoped. And, I mean, he was subject to tough cross-examination over the course of a couple of days. Now, we don't know what a hung jury means, right? It could have been that most of the jurors wanted to convict even on the counts that were so reliant on Gates' testimony. But there were a couple who, believed that the defense was essentially successful in undermining his credibility. So I think that all of that, it's hard to know. All we know is that the jurors could not reach unanimous verdicts to convict on those counts. But, it seems as though probably he's provided all the useful information he had to provide as to the charges that were at issue in this trial. But as we know, there's different conduct that is going to be subject to scrutiny in just a couple of weeks in the D.C. trial. So we don't really know what Gates might provide in conjunction with those proceedings.
And Kate, just real quick, you get 8 out of 18 counts. The rest a hung jury. Do prosecutors consider this a win?
I think they do. Look, I'm sure they would have been happy to go, 100%, 18 out of 18, but they got convictions on a lot of counts. So I think that they're probably very pleased with the result.
All right, I want to head back over to Devin Dwyer now. Kate Shaw, thank you so much. I want to head back over to our coordinating producer, Devin Dwyer. Devin, we heard Kate saying, kind of a mixed bag for the prosecution, but she would say a win ultimately. What does that mean politically? Do you think Robert Mueller is declaring victory right now?
Well, I think the special counsel, certainly, as Kate said there, is probably happy with at least some sort of a guilty conviction here in this case. But I've got to say, politically, for the president, this is not good news. And in fact, the Drudge Report, a very popular conservative blog site, just started bannering Trump's Hell Day to give you a sense of how this is playing in that space. And you remember during the 2016 campaign when all of the president's supporters chanted, lock her up, with respect to Hillary Clinton and her alleged crimes. Well, today you started to hear chants of lock him up outside that courthouse just after that verdict was read. And that's something I think you should keep an eye on as the midterm campaign plays out. Democrats, Diane, have seized on this. They see this as a sign of corruption. They're campaigning against corruption. They're pointing out that the president has surrounded himself with some characters now who have run afoul of the law. And politically, this could be a hot issue in just a few weeks when voters head to the polls.
And Devin, the president is getting ready to speak at a rally tonight in West Virginia. Do you expect him to address this?
Well, he might. As you know very well, he has a hard time resisting comment on the top topics of the news. His team was just asked, actually, on Air Force One. They're flying out to Charleston, West Virginia, where he has a rally at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Sarah Sanders, the press secretary, said she had nothing to comment on right now regarding Paul Manafort or the president's personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, who's in court right now in New York. So no comment officially from the White House. The president heard a question earlier boarding the plane about Manafort. No comment there either. But as we've been talking about, the president has been very fond of Paul Manafort. He's talked about how he thinks that he hasn't been treated fairly, it's been a sad day for the country to see this case go forward, in his view, because of Paul Manafort's connection to the president. And so, it has a lot of people talking about those pardons. You heard Kate mention that's very much on the table. The president hasn't taken those pardons off the table. So it will be worth watching very closely tonight at that rally and in the days ahead how this White House responds and what signal it might send to Paul Manafort and his team. It
will indeed. Devin, thank you. And I actually want to get over to Alex Mallon, who is traveling with the president. And Alex, what do you expect to hear from the president tonight?
Well, I definitely think that at these rallies, whenever it's been in the wake of big news regarding the Mueller investigation, Paul Manafort, the president has been mixed. It's basically a test of whether he's going to be restrained, not to mention these both big bombshell stories that have potential major legal implications for him. But I'll tell you, I've been going around and talking with members of the crowd tonight, mostly before the Manafort news, but after the Michael Cohen news. And most of them just have a hard time separating any of this from what the president on Twitter has called a witch hunt. They largely agree with him here, thinking that it's all part of a deep state looking to him. And I think that it really doesn't matter much to the people there here to hear him go on his typical rally talks about immigration, the tax cuts. Really, right now, not a lot of negative reactions, so I can definitely see a lot of people here fidgeting through their smartphones, trying to get a better sense of what this news actually means.
Yeah, there is a lot to dig through for sure. I wonder if he might choose to speak there, given it is seemingly such a positive crowd that will probably work to his benefit.
Yeah, I mean, in the past, we've definitely heard the president, in the wake, actually, I would bring up his rally at the NRA a couple months ago when he was, dealing with they saw initially as positive news out of the Manafort trial when that judge, T.S. Ellis, was questioning Mueller's mandate. And the President Trump was more than happy to bring it up at that rally. But this, obviously, it's unclear how President Trump might be able to sway this as good news. Certainly in the case of Michael Cohen, there's not a lot of good news you can pull out of there. But perhaps he'll look at that mistrial on those other several counts against Paul Manafort. But we know he spoke glowingly about him just last week on the South Lawn, telling reporters that he's a good man. So potentially that is what we could hear from him tonight. We could just hear the boilerplate witch hunt that we generally hear from him at these rallies. I'm not in the game of predictions right now, but obviously I think there's a lot of anticipation, at least in the press pen here, that we'll hear him address that.
And Alex, given this verdict drops on the same day that the president's, personal attorney and former fixer Michael Cohen is seemingly agreeing to a plea deal, what are the political ramifications here for the president, especially going into an election season, hence the campaign rally?
Well, I think that's interesting. I mean, just like I was saying, I've been talking with members of the crowd here. President Trump's going to be here speaking on behalf of Attorney General Patrick Morrisey. This is a deep red state, and they're going to try and unseat Democratic Senator Joe Manchin. And I'll tell you, I hear nothing but a hardened resolve from the members of this crowd. They want to, participate in this war against the deep state, against Democrats that President Trump's been waging on his Twitter and waging with his public remarks. I think that he's going to be able to just enlist them the same way he's done with all his other rallies that he's been holding across the country.
And Alex, stay with me. I just want to kind of recap for anyone who's just joining us. Paul Manafort, who is facing 18 felony counts ranging in bank fraud and tax evasion, has been found guilty on 8 of those counts. Hung jury on the remaining 10. He was the former campaign chair for the Trump campaign. And We're just sort of running through now the political ramifications and legal ramifications of all this. The president is getting ready to speak at a rally in West Virginia tonight, and Alex Malin, who we're speaking to right now, is traveling with the president. You know, Alex, the prosecutors kind of painted this picture of Manafort as someone who made a lot of money consulting pro-Russian politicians and then sort of hid that money in foreign accounts, got used to this opulent lifestyle, and then when the money ran out, resorted to bank fraud and tax evasion in order to continue that opulent lifestyle. The president at first, you know, seemed to sort of stand by Manafort in a way, but then also kind of distance himself from Manafort. Has he changed his tone at all lately as this verdict has come closer and closer?
Well, I think certainly once the first charges were filed against Manafort, we heard the president trying to distance himself, saying, making the claim that Paul Manafort was only on his campaign for a very short period of time. Well, we know that Paul Manafort was actually a member of the president's campaign for 5 months, and he was campaign chairman during that tenure. So, I think that you see the president now shifting to saying he's a good man. It's a shame. Last week, I think what was interesting is that he said it was a shame for our country what Paul Manafort was going through. So I think that there you hear a real appeal to his supporters who sign up to this kind of deep state out to get the president theory that President Trump's own Justice Department is conspiring against him in some way. But at the same time, we've repeatedly heard the president say that whatever Paul Manafort did, it was completely distanced from his campaign and no direct link to any of his crimes and what he was doing while serving as campaign chairman.
Well, we heard this morning again a witch hunt. We heard the president say that he could actually coordinate the Russia investigation himself and essentially do Robert Mueller's job. So we'll see how he weighs in on that today at that rally in West Virginia, if he weighs in on it at all. What else are we expecting to hear from the president at that rally, Alex?
So I think what Republicans will obviously want him to talk about is these Obama-era coal regulations that the president's administration announced that they're rolling back today. It's going to make it easier for coal producers to kind of ignore those previous environmental regulations that were put on by the Obama administration. They're also going to obviously want to hit the greatest hits of any campaign rally, the GOP's tax cuts. They want him to hit on immigration. I spoke to several members of the crowd earlier who really are big on the immigration issue here. They came to just hear the president talk about building the wall and what the progress is with that. I think that they are less interested in the Russia investigation aspect and Michael Cohen and Paul Manafort and all of these legal troubles that are kind of bearing down on the president. And obviously we see him feeling a little bit cornered based on his tweets in the past couple of days. But I think that they really want to hear him lash out now.
All right. Well, we will stand by to hear that, Alex. Thanks so much for being there for us. We look forward to chatting with you a little bit more about that. But right now I want to bring in Mary Alice Parks, our Deputy Political Director. Mary Alice, you heard us talking to Alex there as the president gets ready to speak at this rally in West Virginia. Do you think it's advisable for him to address both the Manafort verdict and this potential plea from Cohen?
The president hasn't exactly followed advice from legal experts in the past. I doubt he will begin to do so now. It was pretty surprising to a lot of people in the White House, people in Washington, and obviously legal experts around the country that the president weighed in on the Manafort trial while the jury was deliberating over the last few days. So if he was willing to weigh in then, I can't imagine he goes through an entire speech, an entire freewheeling campaign rally tonight without mentioning it.
What do you think the tone is there? Were they counting on this? Is this a complete surprise?
And no, I don't think this was a surprise. The prosecutors laid out a pretty convincing case, especially on those tax charges. Obviously, you've been talking about all the documentation and the evidence that the government presented. I think a lot of people were expecting some guilty verdicts, and at least on some of those charges, because it seemed like such an extensive paper trail.
And Mary Alice, if you could stay with me, I just want to bring in Venu Varghese. He's an attorney who's on the phone with us right now to ask him about that, actually. Venu, we saw the prosecution lay out, I think it was presented 27 witnesses, pieces of evidence, etc. The defense's tactic here seemed to just be, well, they didn't prove their case. Legal experts have said that's not unusual, but given the results, do you think that that was not the correct strategy here?
I'm not sure there was any strategy that would have been the one correct strategy in this case. I think the defense did the best it could with the circumstances. They couldn't put on a case. I didn't see any chance for them to put on a case. And what they did was they attacked. And look, there were 10 counts that the jury came back with no verdict on. So they can take some small solace in that. But unfortunately, the counts that he was convicted upon will carry significant jail time.